Welcome back to our journey through the Bible. In our daily readings, we're inching closer and closer to the end of the apostolic story as told in Acts. These latter chapters of Acts, of course, are focused primarily on the ministry of Paul, and our readings these past few days have brought us into the story of Paul's final visit to Jerusalem before his sailing to Rome, which is going to come up in the readings over the next few days. In the story of Paul in Jerusalem, we read of his initial engagement with the believers in the temple, his arrest, his defense, his appeal to the emperor, and more. What I want to focus in on, however, is that moment of the story of his arrest that we read in Acts 21. This is a slightly longer passage than I often read for these devotionals, but these are verses 27 through 36 of Acts 21. When the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia who had seen him, being Paul, in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd. They seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help! This is the man who's teaching everyone against our people, our law, and this place. More than that, he's actually brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was aroused, and the people rushed together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. While they were trying to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all of Jerusalem was in an uproar. Immediately he took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. When they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the tribune came, arrested him, and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing, some another, and as the tribune could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered Paul to be brought into the barracks. When Paul came to the steps, the violence of the mob was so great that he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Away with him." It was that opening line. The Jews from Asia who had seen him in the temple stirred up the whole crowd. That was the line that grabbed me. In this whole story of Paul's arrest in the temple, that was the notion that jumped out to me. It's a scene we've seen play out recurrently in Paul's journeys. We saw it in another way when we reflected on Demetrius in Ephesus. I think that was just last week. But just try to picture this scene. Paul is in the temple with the other believers. Those who resist his teachings see what's going on, and they stir up the crowd to put an end to this defilement that's coming from Paul. The crowd then gets so riled up that they drag Paul out of the temple, they shut the doors behind him, and they begin to kill him. Even after Paul was taken into custody and questioned by the tribune, a Roman military officer, the very act of trying to move Paul from that questioning to the barracks was threatened by this crowd that was trying vigorously to get their hands on him. The Jews from Asia who had seen him in the temple stirred up the whole crowd. It's a scene we saw play out a number of times in Acts, although not always to this extent. The question that I began to ask myself as I read those words, however, was how many of those people actually knew what was going on? Or perhaps more to the point, how many of those people were swept up by the fervor of the crowd with no idea of what was actually going on? See, that's the challenge of the mob mentality. It seems to be an inherent part of our DNA that we have a certain predilection for communal engagement. We like to be part of a group. That in and of itself is not a bad thing. We're built for community. You've heard me say that many times before. We thrive together. That's not inherently bad. The challenge, however, arises when that drive to be a part of the crowd clouds our judgment regarding that which the crowd is doing. It's great to engage with a crowd, but there are times where we don't spend enough time considering that in which the crowd is engaged. Now, I'm fully aware that there's a certain amount of overlap between what I'm about to say now and that which I said 2 days ago on Tuesday, but I think they are two distinct pieces of a connected puzzle. Because when I read those words of the stirring up of the crowd, I simply couldn't help but think of the rapidity, the speed with which we can become so quickly stirred up in the face of those divides that surround us. Just consider how many times you've read a post on Facebook, Twitter, or somewhere else on social media that you know is clearly false, but that the person posting didn't take the time to check. Some of the people I most deeply respect in my life have been known to do this. Consider how many times Jenny shared a post from Steve because she knows that she thinks like Steve, but Steve got his post from his buddy James, and James got it from his cousin's roommate at college, and so on and so forth. And no one ever bothered to consider the facts behind it, so all the while, the crowd is being stirred up with no consideration of the truth behind the one who is doing the stirring. It's that confirmation bias, that desire to be connected to that greater group that's moving in our direction. We've known people who have done it. Some of us have done it ourselves. But from protests that move from peaceful to not, to political rallies that turn spiteful and divisive, to social media posts that bear little reflection of truth or fact, to so many other corners of our cultural connectivity, we are constantly faced with voices that are seeking to stir up the crowd, and we are constantly facing the battle of trying to discern whether or not we are genuinely moved by the content at question, or if we are simply stirred up by our desire to be connected to the people who are doing the stirring. There are people in every corner of our society right now trying to stir up the crowds against one another. Some have legitimate reason to do so. Others are motivated by more self-serving aspirations. Many are a little of both. All I want to suggest is that we all take a beat before the next time we get swept up into that mob mentality. All I want to suggest is that we simply take a moment to make sure we are actually moved by the movement in question, and not simply drawn in by our desire to be connected to those who are doing the shouting. Let's be in prayer together. God of love, we seek your wisdom and clarity in every moment of our lives. As we look upon this story of Paul, as we are reminded of the compelling power of the stirred crowd, help us to remain ever focused on that which you speak into our lives. Give us, God, the faith to speak with voices loud and clear when your Spirit longs to speak through us. And give us, God, the discernment to realize the discipline to step away when the crowd is stirred in ways that are not your own. For we pray it in his name. Amen. I thank you all, as always, for joining me. I look forward to being with you again next week on Tuesday and Thursday. And in the meantime, I hope we'll see you Sunday for worship at 9 or 11 a.m. Have a wonderful weekend and a blessed afternoon.